Some people live their entire lives believing they're invisible. They walk through crowded hallways, serve others without recognition, and return home to empty apartments where the only sound is their own breathing. Sarah Martinez had accepted this reality for 32 years. She was the nurse who worked double shifts without complaint, the woman who remembered every patient's birthday but forgot her own, the quiet soul who saved lives in the shadows while others took credit in the spotlight. But, sometimes, the universe has different plans. Sometimes, a single moment can shatter the walls we've built around ourselves and reveal that we were never invisible at all, we were simply waiting for the right person to truly see us. What happens when a woman who has spent her life healing others in silence meets a man whose entire existence has been defined by noise, action, and split-second decisions that determine life and death? What occurs when two souls, shaped by completely different worlds of service, collide in the most unexpected way possible? This is the story of how a routine medical emergency became the beginning of something extraordinary. How a helicopter landing changed not just one life, but two. How love found a way to bridge the gap between the chaos of combat and the quiet dedication of healing. Sarah Martinez thought she knew what her life would always be. She was wrong. The fluorescent lights in St. Mary's Hospital hummed their familiar tune as Sarah Martinez adjusted her stethoscope and checked her watch for the 100th time that morning. 7:30. Another 12-hour shift stretched ahead of her like an endless corridor, and she welcomed it. Work was where she disappeared into purpose, where her quiet nature transformed into steady competence. Sarah had learned long ago that being unremarkable was both a blessing and a curse. At 32, she possessed the kind of face that people forgot 5 minutes after meeting her, pleasant features arranged in a way that never demanded attention. Her brown hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, her scrubs always pressed and clean, her voice always measured and calm. She was the nurse who never called in sick, never complained about overtime, never created drama in the break room. The other nurses respected her, but they didn't really know her. How could they? Sarah had spent so many years perfecting the art of being present without being noticed that she sometimes wondered if she was disappearing even from herself. She moved through the cardiac unit with practiced efficiency, checking on Mrs. Chen in room 302, who was recovering from bypass surgery and always asked about Sarah's weekend plans. Sarah would smile and give vague answers, never mentioning that her weekends were usually spent reading medical journals and tending to her small herb garden on her apartment balcony. Mrs. Chen would nod sympathetically, as if understanding that some people's lives were naturally smaller than others. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm. Medications distributed, vitals recorded, families comforted. Sarah had a gift for being exactly what each patient needed: a steady hand, a listening ear, a calm presence in moments of fear and uncertainty. She could explain complex procedures in simple terms, could hold a frightened hand without making it feel like charity, could sense when someone needed silence instead of words. Dr. Williams, the head of cardiology, barely acknowledged her presence during his rounds, even though Sarah had been preparing his patients and anticipating his needs for 3 years. She would have his requested files ready before he asked, would have noticed the subtle changes in a patient's condition that he would then observe and take credit for catching. It was a dance she knew well, the invisible partner who made everyone else look graceful. During her lunch break, Sarah sat alone in the small courtyard behind the hospital, eating a sandwich she had packed at home and watching the medical helicopter land and take off from the pad across the street. She had always found something fascinating about those moments: the sudden urgency, the coordinated chaos, the way people appeared from nowhere to handle whatever emergency was arriving. It was so different from her world of quiet hallways and gentle monitoring. She wondered sometimes what it would be like to be part of something that dramatic, that immediately important. But, then, she would remember that drama required a certain type of person, someone who could command attention and make quick decisions under pressure. Sarah was better suited to the background, to the steady work that kept people alive long after the dramatic moments had passed. The afternoon brought a familiar comfort. Sarah found herself caring for Mr. Rodriguez, an elderly man who had been admitted with chest pain and was waiting for test results. He spoke limited English, and Sarah's basic Spanish helped bridge the gap. She sat with him while his family was delayed in traffic, holding his weathered hand and explaining each procedure in soft, simple words. "You are very kind," he said in careful English, his eyes bright with gratitude. "You have healing hands." Sarah smiled and squeezed his fingers gently. These were the moments that filled the quiet spaces in her life when someone saw her, really saw her, even if only briefly. She treasured these connections, storing them away like pressed flowers in the pages of her memory. As evening approached, the hospital began to settle into its night rhythm. The dinner trays had been collected, visiting hours were ending, and the hallways grew quieter. Sarah was documenting her patient's progress when the first call came through the hospital's communication system. "All available personnel to the emergency department. Multiple trauma incoming. ETA 15 minutes. Sarah looked up from her charts. The cardiac unit wasn't typically involved in trauma cases, but she could hear the urgency in the announcement. Multiple trauma usually meant something serious, a car accident, industrial incident, or worse. She could see some of the newer nurses tensing up, exchanging worried glances. "Probably a car wreck on the interstate," said Janet, one of the more experienced nurses, as she continued her rounds without missing a beat. "Emergency will handle it." But Sarah found herself drawn to the window that faced the helicopter landing pad. Something about the tone of that announcement had been different, more intense than usual. As she watched, she could see emergency personnel preparing the trauma bay, their movements quick and purposeful. 10 minutes later, the sound of approaching helicopters filled the air. Not one, but two. Sarah pressed her face closer to the window, watching as the first helicopter touched down with practiced precision. The crew that emerged moved with military efficiency, and even from her distance, she could see they were transporting someone in critical condition. The second helicopter circled once before landing, and Sarah realized this wasn't a typical medical emergency. The coordination, the multiple aircraft, the way security was positioning itself around the area, this was something bigger. Her supervisor, Margaret, appeared at her elbow. "Sarah, they're asking for additional nurses in emergency. You're one of our most experienced with trauma cases." Sarah blinked in surprise. She had assisted with trauma cases during her training and early career, but that was years ago. "Are you sure they need me?" "I mean, I'm sure there are others who they specifically asked for you," Margaret interrupted. "Apparently, Dr. Williams mentioned your name when they called up for additional staff. Said you were reliable under pressure." This was unexpected. Dr. Williams barely seemed to notice she existed, yet he had recommended her for emergency duty. Sarah felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility that someone had truly seen her professional capabilities. "I'll go right away," she said, already moving toward the supply closet to gather additional materials. As she walked quickly through the hospital corridors toward the emergency department, Sarah could hear the controlled chaos that accompanied serious trauma cases. Voices calling out medical terms, equipment being wheeled rapidly down hallways, the distinctive sound of emergency procedures in progress. She had almost reached the emergency department when she saw him for the first time. He was striding down the hallway ahead of her, his back straight and his movements purposeful despite an obvious limp. Even from behind, everything about him spoke of military bearing. His hair was dark and cropped short, his shoulders broad beneath what looked like tactical clothing. But it was the way he carried himself that caught her attention, alert, controlled, ready for anything. As if sensing her gaze, he turned slightly, and Sarah caught a glimpse of his profile. Strong jaw, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. There was something compelling about his presence, an energy that seemed to fill the space around him. Then, he turned the corner toward the emergency department, and Sarah realized she had slowed her pace without meaning to. She quickened her steps, pushing aside the strange moment of distraction. This wasn't the time for wondering about mysterious strangers. People needed her help. When she arrived at the emergency department, the scene was controlled chaos. Dr. Peterson, the head of emergency medicine, barely glanced up as she approached. "Martinez, good. We've got a situation here. Military training exercise went wrong, and we've got 2 soldiers in critical condition. We also have several personnel who came in with them, including some who may need minor medical attention." Sarah nodded, immediately shifting into her professional mode. What do you need me to do? Take Trauma Bay 3. We've got a soldier with chest trauma, conscious but in significant pain. His vitals are stable, but we need monitoring while we prep him for surgery. Sarah moved quickly to Trauma Bay 3, her training taking over as she pushed aside any nervous energy. The patient was indeed conscious, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, his face pale with pain but his eyes alert. I'm Sarah, your nurse, she said softly as she approached his bedside. I'm going to take care of you while we get you ready for surgery. Can you tell me your name? Private Rodriguez, he said through gritted teeth, and Sarah realized this wasn't the same Rodriguez she had been caring for upstairs. Is my team okay? Is everyone else okay? Sarah began checking his foreline and monitoring his vitals as she answered. The doctors are taking care of everyone. Your job right now is to focus on staying calm and letting us help you. As she worked, she became aware of a presence in the doorway of the trauma bay. Without looking up from her patient, she could sense someone watching, and something about that attention felt different from the usual medical observers. How is he? A deep voice asked from behind her. Sarah turned slightly and felt her breath catch. It was the man she had seen in the hallway, but, up close, the impact of his presence was even stronger. He was tall, probably 6'2", with the kind of build that came from years of physical training. But it was his eyes that held her, dark, intense, and filled with genuine concern as he looked at the young soldier. He's stable, Sarah answered, her voice remaining steady despite the unexpected flutter in her chest. Are you family? The man's mouth quirked slightly, and she caught a glimpse of what might have been a smile. Something like that. I'm his commanding officer. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, Navy SEALs. Sarah nodded, understanding now why the young man had been asking about his team. He's going to be fine. The chest trauma looks worse than it is, and Dr. Peterson is one of the best surgeons we have. Jake Morrison stepped closer to the bedside, his attention focused entirely on his soldier. Rodriguez, how are you feeling? Better now, sir. The nurse here, she's taking good care of me. Jake's eyes shifted to Sarah, and she felt the full force of his attention. It was like being caught in a spotlight she hadn't known she was stepping into. Thank you, he said simply, but something in his tone suggested the words carried more weight than politeness. Sarah found herself looking directly into his eyes for a moment longer than professional courtesy required. There was something there, recognition, perhaps, or curiosity. As if he was seeing something in her that others had missed. Sarah Martinez, she said, extending her hand. And it's my job. When Jake took her hand, his grip was firm and warm, and he held it just a moment longer than necessary. Well, Sarah Martinez, I have a feeling you're very good at your job. The moment stretched between them, filled with something Sarah couldn't quite name. Around them, the emergency department continued its controlled chaos, but, for just those few seconds, everything else seemed to fade into background noise. Then, Dr. Peterson appeared, breaking the spell. Commander Morrison, we need to take Private Rodriguez up to surgery now. You can wait in the family area, and we'll update you as soon as we're finished. Jake nodded, releasing Sarah's hand. Take good care of him, he said to Dr. Peterson, but his eyes remained on Sarah. As the medical team prepared to transport Rodriguez to surgery, Sarah found herself working alongside Jake, both of them focused on reassuring the young soldier. There was something natural about the way they moved together, she realized, her medical training and his leadership experience creating an unexpected harmony. You're going to do great, Rodriguez, Jake said as they reached the elevator. I'll be right here waiting when you wake up. The elevator doors closed, taking the patient and surgical team away, and, suddenly, Sarah found herself alone in the hallway with Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison. The sudden quiet felt charged with possibility. I should get back to check on the other patients, Sarah said, though she made no move to leave. Of course, Jake replied, but he didn't step away either. Sarah, can I ask you something? She nodded, curious despite herself. When you were taking care of Rodriguez just now, you knew exactly what he needed to hear, exactly how to keep him calm. That's not something they teach in nursing school, is it? Sarah was quiet for a moment, surprised by the perceptiveness of his observation. No, it's not. I guess I've just learned that sometimes people need to know that someone sees them, really sees them, especially when they're scared. Jake nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. That's a rare gift. Not really, Sarah said, deflecting as she always did. Any good nurse would do the same thing. Would they? Jake asked, and there was something in his voice that made Sarah look at him more carefully. Because in my experience, most people are too busy or too distracted to really see what's in front of them. But, you're not, are you? Before Sarah could answer, her supervisor Margaret appeared around the corner. Sarah, we need you back upstairs. Mrs. Chen is asking for you specifically, and the night shift is short-staffed. Sarah nodded, grateful for the interruption and, yet oddly disappointed. Of course, I'll be right there. She turned back to Jake, unsure of what to say. I hope Private Rodriguez's surgery goes well. It will, Jake said with quiet confidence. And, Sarah? Thank you. For everything. As Sarah walked back toward the elevators, she could feel Jake watching her go. Something had shifted in that trauma bay, something she couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore either. For the first time in years, someone had looked at her and seen more than just a competent, quiet nurse. The rest of her shift passed in a strange haze of normalcy overlaid with anticipation. She cared for her patients with her usual attention to detail, but part of her mind kept drifting back to those intense dark eyes and the way Jake Morrison had spoken to her, as if her words mattered, as if she mattered. When her replacement arrived at midnight, Sarah found herself hesitating before leaving the hospital. Instead of heading straight for the parking garage, she took a detour past the emergency department, telling herself she was just checking on how Rodriguez's surgery had gone. The emergency department was quieter now, settled into its night rhythm. Sarah approached the nurse's station, where she found Lisa, one of the emergency nurses she knew casually. How did the surgery go for the soldier who came in earlier? Sarah asked. Rodriguez? Oh, he did great. Dr. Peterson said it was textbook. He's in recovery now. Lisa looked up from her charts with interest. Why? Did you know him? I was his nurse when he first came in. I just wanted to make sure he was okay. That's sweet of you. His commanding officer has been here the whole time. Nice guy, very polite. He's in the family waiting area if you want to give him an update about Rodriguez's condition. Sarah felt her heart skip slightly. Jake Morrison was still here. She could walk over to the waiting area right now, could deliver the good news about Rodriguez's surgery, could perhaps continue whatever had begun between them in that trauma bay. But, as she stood there, doubt crept in. What was she thinking? Jake Morrison was clearly someone used to action, drama, the kind of life that demanded attention and recognition. She was a quiet nurse who went home to an empty apartment and a small herb garden. They existed in completely different worlds. Actually, I should head home, Sarah said finally. It's been a long day. Lisa nodded understandingly. Get some rest. I'll make sure to tell Commander Morrison that Rodriguez is doing well. As Sarah walked toward the parking garage, she told herself she had made the right decision. Whatever she had felt in that trauma bay was probably just the intensity of the emergency situation. Jake Morrison would return to his world of helicopters and military operations, and she would return to her quiet life of steady competence. But, as she drove home through the empty streets, Sarah couldn't shake the memory of his voice saying her name, or the way he had looked at her as if she was worth seeing. For just a few hours, she had felt visible in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. When she arrived at her apartment, Sarah stood on her small balcony and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Jake Morrison was probably still at the hospital, waiting to make sure his soldier was truly okay. The thought made her chest tight with something she couldn't quite name. She had spent 32 years learning to be content with invisibility, with being the quiet nurse who did her job well and went home alone. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Sarah Martinez wondered what it would be like to be seen by someone who mattered. As she prepared for bed, Sarah caught herself checking her appearance in the mirror with new eyes, wondering what Jake Morrison had seen when he looked at her. The thought both thrilled and frightened her in equal measure. Tomorrow she would return to her regular shift, to her familiar routine of quiet competence. But something had changed tonight, something that couldn't be unchanged. Sarah fell asleep wondering if she would ever see Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison again, and surprised by how much she hoped the answer would be yes. Sarah arrived at work the next morning feeling oddly off balance, as if the world had shifted slightly during the night and she hadn't quite found her footing yet. She had barely slept, her mind replaying every moment of her encounter with Jake Morrison until she began to doubt her own memory of the intensity she thought she had felt. The cardiac unit was busy with its usual morning routine, and Sarah threw herself into her work with perhaps more focus than usual. She checked on Mrs. Chen, who was recovering well from her surgery, and welcomed 2 new patients who had been admitted overnight. The familiar rhythm of medical care should have settled her nerves, but she found herself distracted, listening for helicopter sounds that never came. During her lunch break, she sat in her usual spot in the courtyard, picking at a salad she had brought from home. The medical helicopter landing pad across the street was quiet, no dramatic emergencies requiring immediate attention. Sarah told herself she was relieved. Drama was not part of her world, and she was better off remembering that. "Mind if I join you?" Sarah's head snapped up, her heart immediately accelerating. Jake Morrison stood beside the bench, looking somehow even more commanding in daylight. He was wearing civilian clothes now, dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt, but he still carried himself with that unmistakable military bearing. "Commander Morrison," she said, moving over to make room on the bench. "How is Private Rodriguez doing?" "Call me Jake, please." He sat down, maintaining a respectful distance while still being close enough that she could catch the subtle scent of his cologne. "Rodriguez is doing great. He wanted me to thank you personally for taking such good care of him yesterday." Sarah felt a flush of warmth at the praise. "I was just doing my job." Jake turned slightly to face her, his dark eyes serious. "You know, you keep saying that, but I watched you with him. That wasn't just professional competence. That was genuine caring." Sarah wasn't sure how to respond to such direct observation. In her experience, people usually overlooked the emotional component of her nursing care, focusing only on the technical aspects. "I suppose I've always believed that healing involves more than just medical treatment. Rodriguez said you made him feel like everything was going to be okay, even when he was scared. He said you had a way of making him feel seen." Jake paused, his eyes never leaving her face. "I imagine that means a lot to your patients." There was that word again, seen. Sarah had used it yesterday when explaining her approach to patient care, and now Jake was reflecting it back to her. It created a strange intimacy, as if they were sharing a language that others might not understand. "How long have you been a nurse?" Jake asked when she didn't respond immediately. 8 years here at St. Mary's, 10 years total." Sarah found herself relaxing slightly, grateful for the shift to safer conversational territory. "I started in a smaller hospital after nursing school, then transferred here when they offered me a position in the cardiac unit." "And you've always worked in cardiac care?" "Mostly. I like the continuity of it, being able to follow patients through their recovery process. Emergency medicine is important, but I prefer building longer relationships with people." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "I can see that about you. You're not someone who does things halfway, are you?" Sarah looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "When you commit to caring for someone, you really commit. It's not just about the procedures or the medication schedule. You invest in the person." Sarah felt exposed by his observation, as if he had seen something she rarely acknowledged even to herself. "I suppose that's true. Sometimes I think I care too much. Is there such a thing as caring too much?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to examine. Before she could formulate an answer, her phone buzzed with a message from Margaret, reminding her that her lunch break was almost over. "I should get back," Sarah said, beginning to gather her things. Jake stood as well. Of course. I didn't mean to keep you. As they walked back toward the hospital entrance, Sarah found herself hyper-aware of his presence beside her. He moved with an easy confidence that she envied, as if he belonged wherever he happened to be. "Sarah," he said as they reached the door, "can I ask you something?" She nodded, though part of her was afraid of what he might ask. "Would you be interested in having dinner with me sometime? I mean, when you're not working a 12-hour shift." The question caught her completely off guard. Sarah stared at him, her mind racing through a dozen reasons why this was a bad idea. They lived in different worlds. She was quiet and ordinary while he was clearly someone who commanded attention wherever he went. What could someone like him possibly see in someone like her? But, when she looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her chest tighten with possibility. He was looking at her with genuine interest, as if her answer actually mattered to him. Yes, she heard herself saying. "I would like that." Jake's face lit up with a smile that transformed his entire expression from serious to boyishly pleased. "Really? That's great. Are you free Saturday evening?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "Perfect. Can I pick you up at 7? I promise somewhere quiet where we can actually talk." After exchanging phone numbers and her address, Sarah watched Jake walk away with that same purposeful stride she had noticed the day before. She stood in the hospital lobby for a long moment, wondering what she had just agreed to and whether she was brave enough to go through with it. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of anticipation and anxiety. Sarah found herself second-guessing her decision to accept Jake's invitation every few hours, but each time she thought about backing out, she remembered the way he had looked at her when he asked, as if she was someone worth pursuing. By the time Saturday arrived, Sarah had changed her outfit 3 times and was seriously considering calling Jake to cancel. She had settled on a simple black dress and minimal jewelry, aiming for understated elegance, but now she worried she looked too formal, or not formal enough, or simply wrong for whatever kind of evening he had planned. When the doorbell rang at exactly 7 o'clock, Sarah took a deep breath and opened the door to find Jake standing in the hallway with a small bouquet of flowers. He was wearing dark slacks and a gray sweater that made his eyes look almost charcoal, and, when he smiled, Sarah felt her nervous energy transform into something warmer. "You look beautiful," he said simply, handing her the flowers. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Thank you. These are lovely." As she put the flowers in water, Jake waited patiently, and she was grateful for his calm presence. There was no awkward small talk or nervous energy from him, just steady confidence that helped settle her own nerves. "So where are we going?" Sarah asked as they walked to his car. "There's a small Italian place about 20 minutes from here. Family-owned, quiet, excellent food. I thought it might be nice to somewhere we could actually hear each other talk." The restaurant was exactly as Jake had described, intimate and warm, with soft lighting and the kind of authentic Italian atmosphere that came from generations of family tradition. They were seated at a corner table that felt private despite the other diners around them. "This is perfect," Sarah said as she looked around. "How did you find this place?" "One of my team members is from this area originally. He's been recommending it for years, but I never had a reason to try it until now." Sarah looked at him curiously. "You don't eat out much?" Jake shrugged, taking a sip of the wine they had ordered. "My schedule doesn't lend itself to regular social activities. When we're not deployed, we're usually training, and when we're training, we're focused on preparing for deployment. It doesn't leave much time for dinner dates." "But you asked me out anyway," Sarah observed. Jake met her eyes directly. "Some things are worth making time for." The simple statement sent a flutter of warmth through Sarah's chest. She wasn't used to being someone's priority, wasn't accustomed to being worth changing plans for. "Tell me about your work," she said, partly to shift the focus away from herself. "What's it like being a SEAL?" Jake was quiet for a moment, as if considering how much to share. "It's demanding. We train for situations most people never have to think about, and when we're called in, it's usually because something has gone very wrong somewhere in the world." "Is it what you always wanted to do?" "Since I was 12, Jake said with a slight smile. My father was Navy, and my grandfather before him. I grew up hearing stories about serving something bigger than yourself, about being part of a team that could make a difference in impossible situations. Sarah could hear the pride in his voice, and, something else, a deep sense of purpose that resonated with her own commitment to healing. It must be difficult, though. The danger, being away from home. It is. But, it's also the most meaningful work I've ever done. When we succeed, when we bring someone home or complete a mission that protects other people, it makes everything else worth it. Sarah nodded, understanding that feeling completely. I think I know what you mean. It's not the same thing, obviously, but nursing can feel that way too. When you help someone through a crisis, when you're there for them during the worst moment of their life, it gives everything else context. Jake leaned forward slightly, his attention focused entirely on her. Tell me about why you became a nurse. Sarah hesitated, not used to being asked about her own motivations. My grandmother was hospitalized when I was 15. Cancer. I spent a lot of time visiting her, and I watched how the nurses cared for her. It wasn't just the medical care, it was the way they made her feel dignified and valued, even when she was scared and in pain. She paused, remembering. There was one nurse in particular, Maria. She would sit with my grandmother when she couldn't sleep, would tell her stories about her own family to distract her during treatments. She made my grandmother feel like a person, not just a patient. And that's what you try to do now, Jake said softly. I try. I don't know if I'm as good at it as Maria was, but I try to remember that every patient is someone's grandmother, someone's child. They deserve to be seen as whole people, not just medical cases. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his eyes thoughtful. You know, yesterday when I watched you with Rodriguez, I thought about something my team leader used to say. He said the most dangerous person on a mission isn't the one making the most noise or getting the most attention. It's the one who sees everything, who notices what others miss, who quietly makes sure everyone else can do their job. Sarah felt a flush of warmth at the comparison. I'm not sure I deserve to be compared to a special operations team. Why not? What you do requires its own kind of courage. You show up every day to care for people in their most vulnerable moments. You take on their fear and pain and somehow transform it into healing. That's not just skill, Sarah. That's valor. Sarah stared at him, stunned by the words. No one had ever described her work in such terms, had ever suggested that what she did required bravery. She had always thought of herself as someone who avoided dramatic situations, who chose the quiet path. I never thought about it that way, she said finally. Maybe you should, Jake replied gently. As the evening progressed, their conversation flowed with surprising ease. Jake told her stories about his team, carefully edited for security but full of affection for the men he served with. Sarah found herself sharing more than she usually did, talking about her patients and her small apartment garden, her weekend volunteer work at a community clinic. You volunteer on your days off? Jake asked with amazement. Just a few hours each Saturday morning. It's a clinic that serves people without insurance. I help with basic care, health education, preventive screenings. Jake shook his head. Sarah, do you ever take time for yourself? The question surprised her. I suppose I don't really think about it that way. The work feels like time for myself, if that makes sense. It does, Jake said quietly. But what do you do for fun? For joy? Sarah was quiet for a moment, realizing she couldn't remember the last time she had done something purely for enjoyment. I read, she said finally. I like to cook. I have my garden. What do you grow in your garden? Herbs mostly. Basil, rosemary, thyme. Some vegetables in the summer. It's not very big, but there's something peaceful about tending growing things. Jake smiled. I'd like to see it sometime. The simple statement sent a thrill through Sarah that she tried not to analyze too closely. You would? Very much. I've never had a garden. We moved around too much when I was growing up, and, since then, I've been deployed more often than not. The idea of creating something lasting, something that grows, I find that appealing. As they walked back to his car after dinner, Sarah realized the evening had passed more quickly than any date she could remember. She hadn't felt the usual anxiety about making conversation or worrying about whether she was interesting enough. With Jake, the silences had been comfortable, and the conversation had felt natural. "Thank you for dinner," she said as they reached her apartment building. "I had a wonderful time." Jake walked her to her door, his presence reassuring in the quiet hallway. "So did I, Sarah. I'd like to see you again. Would that be okay with you?" Sarah looked up at him, seeing something in his eyes that made her breath catch. There was interest there, yes, but also something deeper, a kind of recognition that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before. "Yes," she said softly. "I'd like that very much." Jake stepped closer, raising his hand to gently touch her cheek. "I'm going to be away for 2 weeks starting Monday. Training exercise. But, when I get back, could I take you out again?" Sarah nodded, leaning slightly into his touch. "I'll be here." Jake leaned down and kissed her forehead gently, a gesture so tender that Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'll call you as soon as I can." As Sarah watched him walk away, she realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of herself. For 32 years, she had accepted that she was destined for invisibility, for a life of quiet service without recognition or romance. But Jake Morrison really saw her, and, in his eyes, she wasn't invisible at all. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah found herself thinking about Jake constantly. He called when he could, their conversations brief but warm, and she found herself looking forward to his voice with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. "You seem different lately," Mrs. Chen observed during one of Sarah's routine checks. "Happier." Sarah smiled, unable to deny the observation. "Maybe I am." "It's good to see," the older woman said with a knowing look. "You spend so much time taking care of everyone else. It's nice to see someone taking care of you for a change." Sarah realized that Mrs. Chen was right. For the first time in her adult life, someone was thinking about her well-being, was making an effort to bring joy into her life. It was a new experience, and she was beginning to understand why people took such risks for love. When Jake returned from his training exercise, he called her immediately. "I missed you," he said without preamble, and Sarah felt her heart skip. "I missed you too," she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "Can I see you tonight?" "I know it's short notice, but I've been thinking about you for 2 weeks, and I don't want to wait any longer." Sarah found herself smiling at his directness. "Yes. Come over. I'll cook something." When Jake arrived at her apartment that evening, he looked around with genuine interest, taking in her small but carefully arranged space. He examined her bookshelves, admired the photographs on her walls, and followed her onto the small balcony where her herb garden flourished in neat containers. "This is incredible," he said, gently touching a sprig of rosemary. "You created all of this?" Sarah nodded, pleased by his obvious appreciation. "It's not much, but it brings me peace." Jake turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you." Sarah felt her heart sink, afraid he was about to tell her that the past few weeks had been a mistake, that they were too different for this to work. "I've been thinking about you constantly," Jake said quietly. "Not just missing you, but thinking about the way you see the world, the way you care for people, the quiet strength you have. I've never met anyone like you." Sarah stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I know we've only known each other a short time, and I know my job makes things complicated, but I want you to know that this isn't casual for me." "You're not casual for me." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "Jake." "I don't need an answer right now," he said gently. "I just needed you to know where I stand. You're important to me, Sarah. More important than I expected." As Jake pulled her into his arms, Sarah realized that her quiet life was about to become something entirely different. For the first time in 32 years, someone was choosing her not despite her quiet nature, but because of who she truly was. Standing on her small balcony surrounded by the herbs she had nurtured, held by a man who saw her with perfect clarity, Sarah Martinez finally understood what it meant to be visible. And it was more beautiful than she had ever dared to imagine. 3 months into their relationship, Sarah began to understand that loving Jake Morrison meant learning to live with a constant undercurrent of worry that she had never experienced before. It wasn't the dramatic, overwhelming fear she had imagined military families must feel, but rather a quiet awareness that the person she was growing to love faced dangers she couldn't fully comprehend. Jake was careful never to share details that might compromise security, but Sarah was observant enough to read the signs. The sudden changes in his schedule, the way his phone would ring at odd hours, the occasional tension around his eyes that spoke of missions completed and teammates accounted for. She learned to cherish the peaceful moments between deployments and training exercises, when Jake could simply be present without the weight of responsibility pulling at his attention. Their relationship had settled into a rhythm that surprised Sarah with its naturalness. Jake would appear at her apartment after long days of training, often carrying takeout from whatever restaurant had caught his attention, and they would eat on her small balcony while he asked detailed questions about her herb garden. He had a genuine curiosity about how things grew, about the patience required to nurture something from seed to harvest. "I think I understand why you became a nurse," he said one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the city in golden light. "You have a talent for helping things flourish." Sarah looked at him questioningly, not following his meaning. "Rodriguez called me yesterday," Jake continued. "He wanted to thank me again for bringing him to the right hospital, but he spent most of the conversation talking about you. He said you taught him that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken, it's about helping people remember their own strength." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest. "He said that?" "He did. And he's not wrong. I've watched you with your patients when I've picked you up after shifts. You don't just care for them, you help them see their own resilience." Jake reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. "You do the same thing for me, you know." "What do you mean?" "When I'm with you, I remember that there's more to life than the next mission, the next objective. You remind me that there are quiet kinds of strength, that not everything valuable has to be dramatic or dangerous." Sarah squeezed his fingers, understanding that this was as close as Jake could come to expressing how much their relationship meant to him. He wasn't someone who spoke easily about emotions, but his actions consistently demonstrated his commitment to building something lasting with her. The challenges came, as Sarah had known they would. Jake's first extended deployment after they had grown serious lasted 6 weeks, and Sarah discovered that loving someone whose job could take them anywhere in the world at a moment's notice required a different kind of courage than she had expected. She couldn't tell her coworkers where Jake had gone or what he was doing. She couldn't call him when she'd had a difficult day or share the small victories that made her work meaningful. She could only wait, maintaining her normal routine while part of her attention remained focused on news reports and the subtle changes in her own emotional landscape. "You're worried about him," Mrs. Chin observed during one of Sarah's routine visits. The older woman had become something of a confidant during her extended recovery, and Sarah had grown comfortable sharing carefully edited details about her relationship. "Is it that obvious?" Sarah asked, checking Mrs. Chen's blood pressure with perhaps more focus than the routine task required. "Only to someone who's been where you are," Mrs. Chen said gently. "My husband was Army, deployed 3 times during our marriage. The waiting is its own kind of service." Sarah looked up from the blood pressure cuff, struck by the phrase. "Service? What you do while he's gone, keeping your life stable, being someone he can count on to be here when he returns, holding steady while he does dangerous work, that's service too. It may not get recognition, but it matters." The perspective helped Sarah reframe her experience of Jake's absence. Instead of feeling helpless and anxious, she began to see her consistency and stability as contributions to Jake's ability to focus on his mission. She maintained her routines, excelled at work, and nurtured her garden with new appreciation for the parallels between growing things and growing relationships. When Jake returned, he was different in subtle ways Sarah was learning to recognize. There was a tension around his eyes that spoke of difficult decisions made under pressure, and he held her with an intensity that suggested he had needed to convince himself she was real and safe and still his. "How was it?" she asked as they lay in bed that first night, his arms wrapped around her as if he was anchoring himself to something solid. "Successful," Jake said simply, and Sarah knew that was all the detail he could share. But then, he added, there were moments when I wasn't sure I'd make it back to this. Sarah felt her breath catch at the rare admission of vulnerability. But, you did. I did. Jake pulled her closer, his voice soft in the darkness. Sarah, there's something I need to tell you. Sarah's heart clenched, afraid of what might come next. I love you, Jake said quietly. I know we haven't said it before, and I know my lifestyle makes things complicated, but I needed you to know. What we have, it's worth fighting for. Sarah turned in his arms so she could see his face in the dim light from the window. His expression was serious, vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. I love you too, she whispered, the words feeling both natural and momentous. I was afraid to say it first because I didn't want to add pressure when you have so many other things to worry about. Jake cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gentle against her cheekbones. Sarah, you're not pressure. You're peace. You're the reason I'm careful out there, the reason I make sure I come home. When Jake kissed her, it was with a tenderness that made Sarah's chest ache with the sweetness of being loved by someone who understood both her strength and her vulnerability. She had never imagined that love could feel this solid, this real, this much like coming home to herself. The next few months brought new challenges and deeper intimacy. Sarah met Jake's team during a casual barbecue at one of the other SEALs' homes, and she was surprised by how easily she fit into the group. The other military spouses and partners welcomed her with knowing warmth, understanding without explanation the particular joys and concerns of loving someone in special operations. Jake's different since he met you, Rodriguez told her during that first gathering. He had healed completely from his training injury and was back to full duty. Calmer somehow. More focused. Sarah looked across the yard to where Jake was engaged in animated conversation with several of his teammates, gesturing with a beer bottle as he told some story that had the others laughing. He seems the same to me, she said. Nah, Rodriguez shook his head. Before, Jake was all about the mission, the team, the next objective. Don't get me wrong, he was a great leader, but there wasn't much else there. Now he has something outside of work that matters to him. It makes him more human, you know? Sarah did know, and she was touched by the observation. She had worried that her quiet nature might somehow diminish Jake's natural intensity, but apparently their relationship was adding dimension to his life rather than subtracting from it. The integration wasn't without its difficulties. Sarah had to learn to navigate the social dynamics of military families, where conversations stopped abruptly when classified topics arose and where everyone understood that plans could change instantly based on operational needs. She had to adjust to Jake's need for physical fitness being a job requirement rather than a hobby, which meant early morning runs and workout sessions that structured their shared time. Most challenging was learning to balance her own career ambitions with the realities of loving someone whose job might require them to relocate with little notice. Sarah had been considering pursuing her nurse practitioner degree, but the program would require a significant time commitment that might be difficult to maintain if Jake received new assignment orders. You should do it, Jake said when she finally brought up her concerns. The degree program, I mean. I don't want my career to limit your career. They were sitting on her balcony after dinner, sharing a bottle of wine while Sarah showed Jake the new herbs she had started from seed. The evening was warm, and the city lights were beginning to twinkle in the distance. But what if you get transferred? Or if you're deployed during my clinical rotations? Jake was quiet for a moment, considering. Then, we'll figure it out. Sarah, I've been thinking about something, and maybe this is the right time to talk about it. Sarah looked at him attentively, noting the serious tone in his voice. I'm eligible for a new assignment in 18 months. I could request a position that involves more training and less deployment. It would mean a change in my career trajectory, but it would also mean more stability for us. Sarah stared at him, hardly believing what she was hearing. You'd consider changing assignments for me? I'd consider changing assignments for us, Jake corrected gently. For what we're building together. Sarah, I don't want my job to be the thing that prevents us from having a real future. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. In all her years of being invisible, of accepting that her needs and dreams would always be secondary, she had never imagined that someone would consider reshaping their entire career path to make room for their relationship. "Jake, I don't want you to sacrifice your career for me." "It wouldn't be a sacrifice," Jake said firmly. "It would be a choice. And, besides, you'd be sacrificing just as much by putting your education on hold." "That's not fair either." They talked late into the night about possibilities and compromises, about the future they wanted to build and the adjustments both of them would need to make. Sarah began to understand that real love required both people to be willing to reshape their individual dreams into shared ones. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. They began to plan together in earnest, looking at apartments that could accommodate both of Sarah's growing herb garden and Jake's need for space to maintain his physical fitness routine. They researched nurse practitioner programs that might offer flexibility for military families, and Jake began the process of requesting information about training positions that would keep him stateside more consistently. But, even as they planned for the future, the present continued to demand attention. Jake's work remained dangerous and unpredictable, and Sarah's job at the hospital continued to expose her to the full range of human suffering and resilience. It was during this period of planning and hope that Sarah faced one of the most difficult cases of her nursing career. A young mother, barely 25, was admitted to the cardiac unit with complications from a congenital heart defect. The woman had 2 small children and a husband who worked 3 jobs to pay for her medical care. Sarah found herself deeply invested in the woman's recovery, staying late to explain procedures, coordinating with social services to ensure the family had support, and spending her own break time sitting with the patient when her husband couldn't be there. "You're getting too attached," Margaret warned her gently. "I know it's difficult, but you have to maintain some professional distance." Sarah nodded, understanding the wisdom of the advice, but finding it impossible to follow. There was something about this particular family that reminded her of her own grandmother's struggle with illness, and she couldn't seem to maintain her usual professional boundaries. When the patient's condition worsened unexpectedly, requiring emergency surgery with uncertain outcomes, Sarah found herself more emotionally invested than was healthy. She waited in the hospital long after her shift ended, unable to leave until she knew whether the surgery had been successful. Jake found her in the family waiting area at 10 o'clock that night, still in her scrubs, staring at her hands. "Hey," he said softly, sitting beside her and taking her cold hands in his warm ones. "Margaret called me. She was worried about you." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Her name is Maria. She has 2 little kids, and her husband works so hard just to pay for her medications. If she doesn't make it through this surgery..." Jake squeezed her hands gently. "Tell me about her." Sarah found herself pouring out the details of Maria's case, her worry for the young family, her frustration with a healthcare system that left people choosing between medical care and basic necessities. Jake listened without interruption, his presence steady and comforting. "You know what this reminds me of?" Jake said when she finally fell silent. Sarah shook her head. "The first time I lost a teammate. I was so angry, so focused on everything that had gone wrong, that I almost missed the fact that 4 other guys made it home safely because of the mission we completed. My team leader told me that caring deeply is what makes us good at our jobs, but we can't let the caring destroy us." Sarah looked at him, understanding the parallel he was drawing. "You can't save everyone, Sarah. But the people you do save, the comfort you give to families during their worst moments, the way you help people feel valued and cared for, that matters enormously. This Maria, whether she makes it through surgery or not, she's been blessed to have you caring for her." When the surgeon emerged 2 hours later to report that Maria's surgery had been successful, Sarah felt a relief so intense it left her shaking. Jake held her as she finally allowed herself to cry, releasing the tension she had been carrying for days. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "For what?" "For understanding why I couldn't leave. For not making me feel foolish for caring so much." Jake pulled back to look at her, his expression tender. "Sarah, the depth of your caring is one of the things I love most about you. I'd never want you to change that. As they finally left the hospital together, Sarah realized that Jake had given her something she had never experienced before: unconditional support for who she truly was, including the parts of herself that others sometimes saw as excessive or impractical. Walking to his car in the quiet hospital parking lot, Sarah understood that their love was deepening in ways that went beyond romance. They were becoming true partners, people who could support each other through the challenges their respective careers created. But, even as Sarah felt grateful for the strength of their relationship, she couldn't shake the feeling that their happiness was somehow fragile, that loving someone who faced danger regularly meant living with the constant possibility that everything could change in an instant. She pushed the thought away as Jake drove them back to her apartment, focusing instead on the solid warmth of his hand in hers and the comfort of knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Neither of them could have anticipated that the most serious test of their relationship was only weeks away, or that it would come from a direction neither of them expected. For now, it was enough to be together, to be building something real and lasting, to be learning that love could be both passionate and steady, both exciting and comforting. As Sarah fell asleep in Jake's arms that night, she allowed herself to believe that their love could weather any storm. She had no way of knowing that storms sometimes come from clear skies, and that the strongest relationships are often forged not in moments of happiness, but in moments when everything they'd built seems in danger of being lost. The call came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, jarring Sarah from deep sleep with its harsh electronic insistence. Jake was deployed again, this time for what was supposed to be a routine training mission with Allied forces, and Sarah had grown accustomed to his irregular communication schedule. But calls at 3 a.m. were never routine. Sarah fumbled for her phone, her heart already racing with the particular dread that came with loving someone whose job regularly placed them in harm's way. "Is this Sarah Martinez?" The voice was official, carefully controlled. "Yes, this is Sarah. This is Commander Peterson from Naval Special Warfare Command. You're listed as Lieutenant Commander Morrison's emergency contact." Sarah's world tilted sideways. She sat up in bed, every muscle in her body suddenly tense. "Is Jake okay?" "Ma'am, Lieutenant Commander Morrison was injured during a training exercise. He's alive, but he's been airlifted to Walter Reed Medical Center for treatment. I can't give you details over the phone, but I wanted you to know as soon as possible." Sarah found herself standing without remembering how she had gotten out of bed, her free hand pressed against her chest as if she could physically hold her heart in place. "How bad is it?" she managed to ask. "Ma'am, he's conscious and stable, but beyond that, you'll need to speak with the medical team at Walter Reed. I can arrange transportation for you if you'd like to travel there." The next several hours passed in a blur of practical arrangements and growing anxiety. Sarah called in sick to work, packed a bag with shaking hands, and found herself on a military transport flight to Washington, D.C., accompanied by a Navy chaplain who spoke in gentle, careful phrases that told her nothing and everything at the same time. Walter Reed Medical Center was unlike any hospital Sarah had ever worked in. The military efficiency was obvious in every aspect of the facility, from the precise way information was documented to the crisp movements of medical personnel. Sarah was escorted through a series of checkpoints and brief conversations with officials who verified her relationship to Jake and her authorization to receive information about his condition. Finally, she was brought to the intensive care unit, where a doctor whose name tag read Colonel Martinez briefed her on Jake's injuries with clinical precision. Lieutenant Commander Morrison sustained significant injuries to his right leg and hip during a helicopter training accident, Colonel Martinez explained as they stood outside Jake's room. Multiple fractures, muscle damage, and some nerve involvement. We've completed the initial surgical repair, but he's facing a long recovery period. Sarah absorbed the information with her nursing training, understanding the implications even as her emotional side reeled from the reality of Jake being hurt. Will he be able to return to active duty? She asked. Colonel Martinez's expression was carefully neutral. It's too early to make that determination. Right now, we're focused on healing and determining the extent of the nerve damage. His career prospects will depend largely on how well he responds to treatment and rehabilitation. When Sarah finally entered Jake's room, the sight of him connected to monitors and her lines hit her like a physical blow. He was awake, but groggy from pain medication, and, when his eyes focused on her face, she saw a mixture of relief and something that looked like shame. "You came," he said softly, his voice hoarse. Sarah moved to his bedside, taking his hand carefully to avoid disturbing the foreline. "Of course I came. How are you feeling?" Jake's laugh was bitter and, unlike anything Sarah had ever heard from him. "Like an idiot. We were practicing fast rope insertions from helicopters, something I've done hundreds of times, and I made a rookie mistake. Misjudged the distance, hit the ground wrong." Sarah squeezed his hand gently. "Accidents happen, Jake. Even to experienced people." "Not to me," Jake said with quiet intensity. "Not like this. Sarah, they're talking about medical discharge. My leg, the damage might be too extensive for me to meet physical standards." Sarah felt her heart clench at the pain in his voice. Jake's identity was so thoroughly intertwined with his role as a SEAL that she couldn't imagine how he would process the possibility of that being taken away. "Let's focus on healing first," she said, falling back on the practical approach that had served her well in nursing. "Everything else can wait until we know more." Jake studied her face, and Sarah could see him cataloging her expression, looking for signs of pity or disappointment that she was careful not to show. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." She nodded, though she was afraid of what might come next. "If I can't be a SEAL anymore, if this changes everything about who I am and what I can do, will you still want this? Will you still want us?" The question broke Sarah's heart, not because she had any doubt about her answer, but because Jake felt he needed to ask it. "Jake," she said firmly, "I didn't fall in love with your job. I fell in love with you. The man who notices when Mrs. Chen has a bad day, who learns the names of my herb plants, who sees value in quiet strength. That man doesn't disappear because of an injury." Jake's eyes filled with tears he was too proud to let fall. "I don't know who I am without this, Sarah. Being a SEAL isn't just what I do, it's who I am." Sarah understood his fear, had seen it in patients who faced life-changing diagnoses that forced them to rebuild their sense of identity. But she also saw something Jake couldn't see yet, that his essential character existed independent of his military role. "You're the man who held Private Rodriguez's hand and made him feel safe," Sarah said softly. "You're the person who spent 2 hours listening to me worry about Maria's surgery. You're someone who values service and commitment and taking care of people. Those qualities don't require perfect physical fitness, Jake." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jake's commanding officer, Commander Hartley, a stern-looking man in his 50s who greeted Sarah politely before launching into a discussion with Jake about the investigation into the accident and the timeline for determining Jake's fitness for duty. Sarah excused herself to give them privacy, using the time to call her supervisor at St. Mary's and explain that she would need to take extended personal leave. Margaret was understanding, having dealt with military families before, and assured Sarah that her position would be held for as long as necessary. When Sarah returned to Jake's room, Commander Hartley was preparing to leave. "Ms. Martinez," he said as he gathered his papers, "I want you to know that Lieutenant Commander Morrison is one of the finest officers I've served with. Whatever happens with his medical status, that doesn't change." After the commander left, Jake was quiet for a long time, staring at the ceiling with an expression Sarah couldn't read. "He's being kind," Jake finally said. "But we both know that finest officer doesn't matter if I can't do the job anymore." Sarah pulled her chair closer to his bed. "Jake, what if this isn't an ending? What if it's a beginning of something different?" Jake looked at her skeptically. "Like what?" "I don't know yet. But I know that your skills, your leadership ability, your commitment to service, those things could translate to other kinds of work. Maybe training new recruits, maybe working with veterans who are transitioning to civilian life, maybe something we haven't even thought of yet." "You make it sound easy." "It's not easy," Sarah admitted. "It's terrifying and uncertain and completely different from what you planned. But, Jake, some of the most meaningful changes in life come from things we never would have chosen." Jake was quiet, considering her words. "How did you get so wise about life transitions?" Sarah smiled slightly. "I've been reinventing myself since I met you. The quiet nurse who never took risks or spoke up for what she wanted. She's been learning to be someone different too. Over the following weeks, Sarah established a routine that balanced supporting Jake through his medical care while managing her own needs and responsibilities. She found temporary housing near Walter Reed, arranged for extended leave from work, and essentially relocated her life to be present for Jake's recovery. The rehabilitation process was grueling and often discouraging. Jake's injuries were healing, but slowly, and the extent of the nerve damage wouldn't be fully known for months. He struggled with physical therapy sessions that left him exhausted and frustrated, with the uncertainty about his future, and with the loss of the physical capabilities he had spent years developing. Sarah watched Jake fight depression and identity crisis with the same determination he had once brought to military training. Some days were better than others, but the overall trajectory was toward acceptance of his new reality, even if that reality remained unclear. "I've been thinking about what you said," Jake told her one evening as they sat in the small apartment she had rented near the hospital. He was walking with a cane now, having graduated from the wheelchair, but his gait was still unsteady. "About what?" "About this being a beginning instead of an ending. I've been talking to some of the other guys here who are going through medical discharge. There are organizations that help veterans transition to civilian careers, programs that match military skills with corporate needs." Sarah felt a flutter of hope. "That sounds promising. There's also a possibility of staying in the Navy in a non-operational role. Training, policy development, administrative positions. It wouldn't be the same as being a SEAL, but it would still be service." Sarah could hear the careful hope in his voice, as if he was afraid to want something too much. "What appeals to you most?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "Honestly? I keep thinking about what Rodriguez said that day about you teaching people to see their own strength. I think I might be good at that. Helping other veterans figure out how to translate what they learned in the military to civilian life." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on their door. Sarah opened it to find Rodriguez and 2 other members of Jake's team, all carrying bags of takeout food and wearing carefully casual expressions. "We thought you might be tired of hospital food," Rodriguez said by way of explanation. The evening that followed was one of the most healing Sarah had witnessed since Jake's accident. His teammates treated him exactly as they always had, including him in their jokes and conversation without any awkwardness about his injury or uncertain future. They talked about mutual friends, upcoming missions, and ordinary team dynamics, creating a bridge between Jake's past identity and his evolving sense of self. "You know," said Martinez, one of the newer team members, as they were cleaning up after dinner, "when I was trying to decide whether to re-enlist, you told me that service comes in many forms. That advice is looking pretty relevant right about now." Jake looked at him questioningly. "What I mean is, maybe your service is changing form, but it's not ending. Maybe you're supposed to help people in a different way now." After his teammates left, Jake sat quietly on the couch, his injured leg elevated, staring out the window at the city lights. "They're right, aren't they?" he said finally. Sarah settled beside him, careful not to jostle his leg. "About what?" "About service taking different forms. I've been so focused on what I can't do anymore that I haven't thought much about what I might be able to do differently." Sarah took his hand, noticing that some of the tension he had been carrying for weeks seemed to be easing. "I want to do something meaningful with my life," Jake continued. "Maybe not the same kind of meaningful, but something that matters. And I want to do it with you, if you're willing to build something completely different from what we originally planned." Sarah turned to face him fully. "Jake, I've learned something these past few months. The life we planned together was just one possibility. There are others, and some of them might be even better than what we originally imagined." Jake leaned over and kissed her forehead, the gesture tender and familiar. "I love you for seeing possibilities when I could only see limitations. I love you for being willing to reimagine everything for the sake of what we're building together." As they sat together in the quiet apartment, Sarah realized that their relationship had been tested in ways neither of them could have anticipated, and it had emerged stronger than before. They had learned that love could survive disappointment, uncertainty, and the complete reshaping of shared dreams. Jake's recovery would continue for months, and his career transition would take even longer. There would be more difficult days, more uncertainty, more moments when the future seemed unclear. But Sarah was no longer afraid of those challenges. She had discovered that loving someone deeply meant being willing to rebuild your entire life alongside theirs when circumstances demanded it. And she had learned that sometimes the strongest relationships are forged not in moments of triumph, but in moments when everything falls apart and two people choose to rebuild together. Looking at Jake as he dozed against her shoulder, his face peaceful for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt grateful for the helicopter accident that had first brought them together and, strangely grateful even for the second helicopter incident that had tested their commitment to each other. Both events had shown her that love was not a passive emotion, but an active choice to remain present and supportive through whatever life might bring. And, as she watched Jake sleep, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she would continue making that choice for as long as she lived. The quiet nurse and the wounded warrior had found in each other something neither had known they needed: a partner willing to face uncertainty with courage, to rebuild dreams when necessary, and to discover that sometimes the life you end up with is more meaningful than the life you originally planned. 2 years after the accident that changed everything, Sarah stood in the kitchen of the small house she and Jake had purchased together, watching through the window as he worked in their expanded garden. His movements were different now, more deliberate, careful of his balance, but there was a contentment in his posture that she had never seen during his years as an active SEAL. The house was a compromise between their individual needs and their shared dreams. Large enough for Sarah to have a proper herb and vegetable garden, close enough to the Veterans Administration Hospital where Jake now worked, and situated in a neighborhood that felt like home to two people who had spent years serving others. Jake had found his new calling in ways neither of them could have anticipated. After completing his medical discharge from the Navy, he had taken a position with a non-profit organization that helped veterans transition to civilian careers. His combination of military experience and hard-won understanding of life after service made him uniquely qualified to guide other veterans through their own identity transitions. "I never realized how many guys struggle with feeling invisible after they leave the military," Jake had told Sarah during his first weeks in the new role. "They go from being part of something clearly important to feeling like nobody understands what they have to offer." Sarah had smiled at his use of the word invisible, remembering her own long experience with that feeling. "And you help them see their own value again?" "We help them translate their military experience into language that civilian employers understand, and we help them see that their service record is an asset, not a liability. But, mostly, we help them realize that their identity is bigger than their job, whatever that job might be." The irony was not lost on either of them that Jake was now teaching other veterans the same lessons Sarah had taught him during his darkest days at Walter Reed. Sarah had also found her work evolving in unexpected directions. She had completed her nurse practitioner degree through a program designed for working professionals, and she now split her time between the cardiac unit at St. Mary's and a clinic that specialized in treating veterans and their families. The combination allowed her to use her clinical skills while also working alongside Jake in the veteran community. "You two make quite a team, Dr. Williams had observed when he learned about Sarah's new role. "Morrison's program refers patients to your clinic, and your medical background helps you understand what the veterans and their families are dealing with." It was true. Sarah and Jake had discovered that their individual experiences had prepared them to work together in ways that amplified both of their capabilities. Jake understood the military culture and the identity challenges that veterans faced, while Sarah understood the medical and emotional complexities of recovery and transition. Their personal relationship had deepened through these professional parallels. They had learned to be true partners, supporting each other's work while maintaining their individual identities and goals. The morning routine they had established was a reflection of this partnership. Jake would wake early to work in the garden before the heat of the day, tending to the vegetables with the same methodical attention he had once brought to military planning. Sarah would prepare breakfast and review her patient files for the day, often joining Jake outside with her coffee to discuss their respective schedules. "Mrs. Patterson is coming in today," Sarah said as she settled onto the small bench Jake had built beside the garden beds. "The veteran's wife who's been having anxiety issues." Jake looked up from the tomato plants he was staking. "How is she doing with the counseling referral?" "Better. She said it helps to talk to someone who understands what it's like to worry about someone in a dangerous job, even when that job is in the past. Jake nodded, understanding the complex emotions that military families navigated even after active service ended. The invisible injuries are sometimes the hardest to heal. They had both learned this truth through personal experience. Jake's physical recovery had been measurable and gradual, but the emotional adjustment to his new identity had been more complex and ongoing. Sarah had her own adjustment process as well, learning to see herself as someone whose voice mattered in professional settings, whose insights were valued by colleagues and supervisors. "I have something to tell you," Jake said as he brushed soil from his hands and joined her on the bench. Sarah looked at him curiously, noting a mixture of excitement and nervousness in his expression. "I got a call yesterday from the Department of Veterans Affairs. They want to expand our transition program nationally, and they've asked me to head up the implementation." Sarah felt her heart leap with pride and excitement. "Jake, that's incredible. You'd be helping veterans all across the country." "It would mean some travel, probably about 1 week per month to start, and eventually we might need to relocate to Washington for a couple of years to oversee the program development." Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes, excitement about the professional opportunity balanced with concern about how the demands would affect their relationship. "What do you think?" Jake asked. "Is this something you could see yourself supporting?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering not just the practical implications but the deeper meaning of what Jake was asking. He was including her in a major career decision, treating their relationship as a true partnership where both people's needs and dreams mattered. "I think it's exactly the kind of work you're meant to be doing," she said finally. "And, Jake, I've been thinking about some changes of my own." "What kind of changes?" "Dr. Peterson at the VA clinic has been encouraging me to pursue a doctorate in nursing. There's a program that focuses on healthcare policy and veteran services. If I did that, I could potentially work on improving medical care for veterans at a policy level." Jake's face lit up with understanding. "We could both be working on veteran issues, just from different angles. And if the work took us to Washington for a few years, I could pursue the doctorate there. It might actually be perfect timing." Jake took her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar pattern across her knuckles that had become one of their most intimate gestures. "Sarah, do you ever think about how different our lives would be if I hadn't gotten hurt?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "Sometimes." "Do you?" "I used to think about it a lot, especially during the worst of the recovery. But, lately, I think about how much we might have missed if things hadn't changed. I might never have discovered this work that feels so meaningful. You might never have pushed yourself to grow professionally in the ways you have." Sarah nodded, understanding what he meant. "We might have stayed comfortable but never grown into who we were supposed to become." "Exactly. Sometimes I think the accident was the best thing that ever happened to us, even though it was also one of the worst." As they sat in their garden surrounded by the plants they had nurtured together, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years ago, she had been a quiet nurse who believed her role in life was to remain invisible while caring for others. Jake had been a warrior whose identity was completely tied to his physical capabilities and military role. They had both been forced to reimagine themselves, and, in that process of rebuilding, they had discovered strengths and possibilities neither had known existed. "There's something else I want to discuss with you," Jake said, his voice taking on a tone Sarah had learned to recognize as significant. She turned to give him her full attention. "I've been thinking about our future, about the life we're building together. Sarah, I want to marry you." Sarah felt her breath catch, though the proposal itself was not entirely unexpected. They had been talking about marriage in general terms for months, but hearing Jake say the actual words made her heart race with joy. "I don't have a ring yet," Jake continued, "because I wanted to talk to you first about what kind of wedding you'd want, what would feel right for us." Sarah found herself laughing, not from amusement but from pure happiness. "Jake Morrison, are you proposing to me in our vegetable garden?" Jake's expression shifted from nervous to amused. "I suppose I am. Is that okay?" "It's perfect," Sarah said, leaning over to kiss him. "And, yes, absolutely yes. They spent the rest of the morning planning a future that would honor both their individual dreams and their shared commitment to service. They talked about a small wedding ceremony that would include both their families and the extended community of veterans and medical professionals who had become their chosen family. "I want Rodriguez to be in the wedding party," Jake said. "He was there at the beginning of our story." "And I want Mrs. Chen to come," Sarah added. "She's been following our relationship from the beginning too." As they planned, Sarah realized that their wedding would be a reflection of everything they had learned about love and partnership. It would celebrate not just their commitment to each other, but their shared dedication to helping others heal and grow. Later that afternoon, Sarah called in to work to request the next day off, explaining that she had something important to discuss with her supervisor. She wanted to talk to Dr. Peterson about the doctoral program Jake had mentioned, and she wanted to begin the process of potentially transitioning her career to focus more heavily on veteran services. "You know," she told Jake as they prepared dinner together, "2 years ago I never would have had the confidence to pursue a doctorate, much less to consider changing the focus of my entire career." "What changed?" Jake asked, though Sarah suspected he knew the answer. "You helped me see that I was capable of more than I realized. And going through your recovery with you taught me that we can handle much bigger challenges than we think we can." Jake nodded, understanding completely. "You taught me that identity isn't fixed, that we can become different people when circumstances require it." That evening, they called both their families to share the news of their engagement. Jake's parents, who had worried about how he would adjust to life after his military career, were thrilled to hear how well he was doing both personally and professionally. Sarah's mother, who had always worried that her daughter was too self-effacing to find lasting love, was moved to tears by the obvious happiness in Sarah's voice. "He sounds wonderful, sweetheart," her mother said during their call. "And you sound different somehow. More confident." "I feel different, Mom." "Good, different." Later, as they sat on their small back porch watching the sunset, Sarah reflected on the strange turns that life could take. She had always believed that happiness came from staying quiet, avoiding risk, and accepting whatever life offered without asking for more. But loving Jake had taught her that the deepest happiness often came from being willing to risk everything for something meaningful, from speaking up for what mattered, and from actively building the life you wanted rather than passively accepting the life that circumstances provided. "Jake," she said as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, "do you remember what you said that first night we had dinner? About some things being worth making time for?" Jake smiled, obviously remembering the moment. "I do. I think this whole experience has taught me that some things are worth changing everything for." Jake reached over and took her hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "I love you, Sarah Martinez," he said softly. "I love you too, Jake Morrison. And I love the life we're building together." As they sat together in comfortable silence, Sarah thought about all the patients she had cared for over the years, all the families she had comforted during difficult times. She had always told them that healing was possible, that people were stronger than they realized, that difficult circumstances could sometimes lead to unexpected blessings. Now she knew these truths from personal experience. She and Jake had both been broken in different ways, he physically, she emotionally, and they had healed each other while learning to heal themselves. The quiet nurse who had once felt invisible had found her voice and her purpose. The warrior who had lost his physical capabilities had discovered new ways to serve and lead. Together, they had built something stronger than either could have created alone. A year later, Sarah stood in the small church where she and Jake were married, surrounded by a congregation that perfectly represented the community they had built together. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Rodriguez and Jake's other military friends served as groomsmen. Sarah's colleagues from both hospitals filled several pews, and the entire gathering included veteran families they had both worked with over the years. As Sarah walked down the aisle toward Jake, who stood waiting with the kind of smile that lit up his entire face, she marveled at how full her life had become. The quiet nurse who had once eaten lunch alone and gone home to an empty apartment was now surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her happiness. The ceremony itself was simple but deeply meaningful. Jake had written his own vows, speaking about how Sarah had taught him that strength came in many forms and that the most powerful healing happened not through dramatic intervention but through consistent, patient care. Sarah's vows spoke about how Jake had helped her understand that being seen and valued was not something she had to earn through perfection, but something she deserved simply by being herself. "I promise to see you clearly, even when you can't see yourself," she said, her voice clear and confident. "I promise to believe in our dreams even when they have to change, and I promise to build whatever life we want together, one small step at a time." When Jake kissed his bride, the congregation erupted in applause that spoke to more than just celebration of their marriage. It was recognition of a love story that had begun with service, been tested by crisis, and emerged stronger through the choice to rebuild everything together. At the reception, Rodriguez gave a toast that brought tears to many eyes. "Jake and Sarah taught me something important," he said, raising his glass. "They taught me that the best love stories aren't about two perfect people finding each other. They're about two people who choose to grow into better versions of themselves together." As the evening wound down and Sarah and Jake prepared to leave for their honeymoon, a week in a small coastal town where they planned to rest, read, and plan their shared future, Sarah took a moment to step outside and look up at the stars. Jake found her there, loosening his tie as he joined her on the small balcony outside the reception hall. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Sarah leaned against him, grateful for the solid warmth of his presence. "I'm thinking about that first night in the emergency room, when you asked me if I really saw people or if that was just something they taught in nursing school. I remember. I said that sometimes people need to know someone sees them, especially when they're scared. I was talking about patience, but I think I was also talking about myself without realizing it." Jake wrapped his arms around her from behind. "And now? Now I know what it feels like to be truly seen, and I know what it means to see someone else completely. It's the most beautiful gift two people can give each other." As they stood together under the stars, married now and committed to a future that would undoubtedly bring new challenges and changes, Sarah felt profoundly grateful for the helicopter accident that had brought a wounded warrior into her emergency room and changed the trajectory of both their lives. She had learned that love was not a passive emotion but an active choice, made new every day, to see and cherish another person completely. She had discovered that the strongest relationships were built not on convenience or compatibility, but on the willingness to rebuild dreams together when circumstances demanded it. Most importantly, she had learned that being truly seen by another person and seeing them in return was indeed the most beautiful gift two people could share. The quiet nurse and her wounded warrior had found in each other something neither had known they were looking for: a partner willing to grow, change, and build whatever kind of life love required. And, as they drove away from their wedding reception toward whatever adventures awaited them, both Sarah and Jake knew with absolute certainty that they had found something worth every risk they had taken to build it. Their story would continue to unfold, filled with the ordinary moments and extraordinary love that defined the deepest partnerships. But, that night, driving through the quiet streets of their city toward their new life together, they were simply two people who had learned that love was not about finding someone perfect, but about choosing someone worth growing with. And, in that choice, made new each day, they had discovered that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin not with dramatic gestures, but with the quiet decision to see someone clearly and love them completely, exactly as they are and as they choose to become.